So today we're going to talk about the demographic transition eventually, and in the short run we'll also talk about population age structure and pay-go pensions. It's an action-packed, chock-filled afternoon here. We've got a bunch of stuff to cover in addition to covering some of the more mundane things like announcements. We're going to make Lab 6 due on Friday. Office hours were very productive, but we realized that there are some tremendously difficult questions at the end of Lab number 6, and also a heck of a lot of programming. Okay, as folks come in, yes, if we could curb the externality of additional sound, that might be good. We can whisper, that would be helpful. Thank you very much. So lab number 6 will be due on Friday instead of tomorrow to help folks out. It's a tough lab. I found that out myself. I've not worked through the lab, or at least I didn't until students came in office hours, and I realized how challenging much of it was, what with the empirical data work in Lab 6 and also some of the conceptual questions in Lab 6 as well. Today is Super Tuesday, the superest of all Tuesdays. It is crazy, right? California, Texas, Minnesota, I think North Carolina too, maybe, right? There are a very large number of delegates up at stake today. And of course, it's been a very wild ride recently. I got to say, I'm kind of bummed because I was totally going to vote for Pete Buttigieg, but then he dropped out on Sunday. So, yeah, that kind of bummed me out. So if things like that are bumming you out too. My home state of Minnesota is also voting today, and they're probably bummed out because their home senator. One of the best parts is that, and this will probably echo for only some of you, that there's the two senators in the state of Minnesota were named Amy and Tina, and I think still might be, which is just like the hosts of Weekend Update on Saturday Night Live, Tina Fey and Amy Poehler, about 10 years ago now, I guess. So if you were when you were 10 years old and allowed to watch Saturday Night Live, you might remember that reference, and otherwise maybe not. Okay, on to some pressing stuff for us. So preparedness plans, we'll get to that in a second. This is important, that we think about backup plans. So where are we at with COVID-19? Well, if you're like me, you're rather amazed at the rapid pace of developments and the complete and utter lack of centralized, useful, newsy messaging by our government and media. It's kind of, to me, that's the most unnerving part, right? So the stock market is in a correction, in part because of the uncertainty here, and right? Of course there's uncertainty because our governments and medias can't seem to get it together to say anything clearly about things. And one can say that, well, so nobody wants to get it wrong by saying some statement and then, okay, but that's also very uninformative, just not to say anything at all. So if you're like me, and I maybe you're not, I don't know, you might want somebody to try to sift through the details here. And so let me see if I can find this quickly, if my internet is working. I think it is. So I am a huge fan. I wish I had put this in the slides. I didn't. But Professor Emily Oster at Brown is absolutely fantastic. And she managed to do, this is actually, it looks like an advertisement, it sort of is. But the joke is that she did actually go and get some Skippy at the grocery store to load up on supplies just in case it was not advisable to go to grocery stores. So here is what she has to say. So if you search for Emily Oster, and I'll try to put the link into the slides. I thought this was very helpful because just like in her books on pregnancy and being parents, and just like in her academic research, she boils down stuff into salient things. And we've already talked about some of the salient things here in class. I think you and I are in pretty good shape, honestly, with the coronavirus. I think it's elderly people, especially people with a history of smoking and lung diseases, who are not in good shape. So, I think for you and me, the risk is low, and she kind of walks you through all that. And I also think for children, I think the risks are fairly low as well. Nonetheless, though, these are some alarming developments. So as of last night when I wrote the slide, 6 deaths up in Washington State. I think, again, they were people in hospice care, perhaps, or nursing homes. I think these were elderly people. But, 6 deaths is a lot. And a confirmed case in Alameda County who was a healthcare worker who was commuting, it appears, up to Vacaville, I think, where that person apparently was infected. So CDC is ramping up testing. Previous standards allowed very little of this. And so, we are all waiting, I think, for the post-mortem so to speak, hopefully, not actually post-death, but the post-mortem is the idiom for what in the world happened and why was the government caught so flat-footed with no testing? Because the problem with these sorts of things is that if you're not testing, the genie gets out of the bottle. And then who in the world do you test without running outrageously high costs of testing everybody? So what I can say, though, is that I am reassured by Berkeley preparedness here. And so we all got an email from the Executive Vice Chancellor, EVC Provost Paul Alivisatos, who sent out this very newsy message to us. And so we do need to think about some potential changes to the class. So I think instruction can continue regardless. We are all committed to getting you your units and training. So I don't think there's great need for concern, but we need to think about alternatives. The tech that we have is pretty awesome. I have never used Zoom for 300 people, but apparently it can be done. Google Hangouts is the other tool that many of us use on campus and many of you possibly use, or if you have an iPhone, you use FaceTime. These are all similar versions of the same sort of thing, which is video conferencing. The biggest problem, of course, in a large video conference is that the devil's always in the details. You've got to figure out how in the world you're going to handle questions during a video conference with 300 people. So I am on top of that. We'll figure it out if we need to do that. And in the short term, obviously, if something were to happen between now and next Tuesday, we would reassess the format of the midterm. And I think what we would do is turn it into a take-home exam if we were unable to meet here in this lecture hall. So the plan is business as usual, but we need to be prepared to change that. And so right now what we would do is kind of shift to cyber learning. If you think that might be a problem for you, and it would be if you don't have ready access to a computer, then please get in touch with me. Send an email or talk after class. And I wish I'd put this in here. I did not. Everybody wash your hands. For goodness sake, everybody wash your hands as much as you possibly can, especially all the men. Because we know from the New York Times reporting on this, men actually seem to wash their hands. Even male healthcare workers apparently wash their hands less often than female ones, even though they have the same jobs. And so if there's something about just being male that makes you think, I don't know, you're impervious or whatever it is. Maybe it's similar to riding motorcycles when you're young. That seems to be a little bit more of a thing that silly males tend to do when they're young and they get into car crashes and things like that. So please wash your hands. Everybody wash your hands. I will absolutely wash my hands. Questions? Okay, well, if you do think of a question as we go on, don't hesitate to pull us back and ask a question about preparedness. It's pretty important. Okay, all right, otherwise, so our next meeting on Thursday will be an in-class review, and a good strategy here would be to look at the 2019 midterm and formulate some questions and bring those questions with you, even if it's just that you look at it right before you show up to class. That would work as well. I'll have nothing prepared for Thursday, so please bring questions. If there are no questions, we'll just go ahead and adjourn. I bet there will be questions, so please have yours ready. 1 week from today, provided that we are still meeting in large numbers on campus, and there's no indication that we won't be, 1 week from today we'll have a midterm exam here in class during the regular class time, and then we will have new instruction on the Thursday, a week and a half roughly from today, and then also that following week. And that's the part of the class that may be much more salient to many of you. I know these days it is for me. Right now we're in the part of the class where we're dealing with big models of big things like populations and capital stocks and climate change, big stuff. And after the midterm, we're moving into more of the microeconomics of population, and in particular of family formation, childbearing, work, and care for children and for the elderly, things that I think are much more easy to understand on a personal level, right? It's very hard to get your head around population dynamics. We're all people, but that doesn't mean that it's easy to understand population dynamics. And whereas I think it's much more easy to get some intuition about basic choices that households and people make on a daily and lifetime basis. Okay. And then spring break week after we start that material. Questions about the pace of the course? So material today is fair game for the midterm. We're going to talk about the Social Security system to some extent. not going to go into great detail. There's a lot to be said about that. The old age dependency ratio, which is kind of the most salient quick statistic that will tell you about the health of that sort of program. And then we'll talk about the demographic transition, and that is the last topic then that is fair game for the midterm. How might you study? So I would look at lecture slides, videos, discussion, and I would think about what you talked about in the optional sections and in office hours. Many students have made great use of office hours. Piazza discussions, if you've had those as well, and those presumably are public and viewable. Then I would look at the labs. The labs are very useful. They also, I think, don't reflect as well as this stuff the material that you're likely to see on the exam for a couple of reasons. So the labs are written in the programming language of R, and they are empirical in nature, and we're not going to do stuff quite like that on the exam. And also the labs are a tremendous gift by the usual instructor of this course, and thus tend to reflect the way that that person would have written questions and not so much the current crop of your instructors, me and the GSIs. So I would look at the labs, but I would not count on stuff that's just in the labs making it into the exam. And then after that, you could have a look at the required readings. Many of them are very, very dense, but there are some highlights there. One of them actually is I really am fond of Ronald Lee's article from 2003 on the demographic transition, which was assigned today. That's one. Another one is that it's a tough read, but read the beginning and the end of Piketty and Size. And don't read Malthus. Don't read Malthus. That's just torture. Reading anything that was written before about 1950 is torturous, I think, honestly. Okay. Questions about this? Yeah. I'm not sure I follow you totally, so let me try to summarize. It's complicated questions, probably from Lab 6, about capital and solo models and fertility. So Lab 6 is very difficult. It is not something I could understand jumping into at the end. I would not expect anything quite as complicated as Lab 6. There may be things, and what you should expect is variation on the basic stuff you see in class. So we might take something like the Malthus model and tweak it in some way, and that's fair game. But I thought Lab 6 was very challenging, and I would not expect that to show up on the exam. Yes?
If you can make the optional sections, is there any way to access the material?
That's a good question. If you didn't make it to the optional sections, is there a way to access the material? And I'm not sure. We'll huddle and come up with an answer for that. My guess is, unfortunately, I don't think it was recorded, but the GSIs may have some notes, and if there are some notes, we'll share them. The other thing to do, of course, is there are slides posted on B courses? Okay, there are slides posted on B courses. And of course, you could try word of mouth through Piazza, too, word of typing mouth. Yes? Is there a way to get solutions on the practice midterm? Not at this time, but we may release those after Thursday, maybe? We'd like you to, look at the thing blank, so it spurs you to ask questions. Yeah. Other questions? Okay, moving ahead. All right, so we did some of this last time. The PAGO identity, meaning that the inflows have to be equal to the outflows. And so with pension systems, that means that the benefits that are paid out to retirees, which is going to be a function of the benefit rate, the benefit per retiree, that's little b. It's always a challenge, right? So it's not births right here. We tend to run out of letters, and I guess we could have used beta or something like that, because you'd like the first letter to be the same as the word, but then the problem is birth and benefit, and of course, both begin with the letter B. So here, this is the benefit rate per retiree, and so NO is the number of old people who are retirees. That has to be equal to the tax rate on earnings, that's little y, of the workers, NW. So this has to be true if what you're doing is paying out cash to retirees based on a payroll tax. And to a first approximation, this is kind of what Social Security is. There is what's called a trust fund, and the trust fund was being built up over time as recently as probably 20 years ago, maybe 25, but it's been declining now. It's a good question as to when it started declining. The trust fund is declining. And the reason is we have more retirees drawing higher benefits than we have taxes and workers being paid into the system. So this is actually somewhat out of balance right now. But you can think about this as being the thing that we aspire to kind of average out over long periods of time, and the trust fund helped us do it, sort of, I guess. There's more to be said with that. This is a useful rearranging then. So suppose we were to isolate the tax rate on one side. So you divide both sides by little y and w, and you might sort of arrange them in this way, where here's the benefit per retiree expressed as the share of the earnings per current worker. So that's then easily interpretable as a replacement rate. And if you talk to your parents or grandparents who may be approaching retirement, they may talk about this. The replacement rate being, what your annual take would be if you retired and were drawing from the pension that you could earn, or you would work. And so, what's the sweet spot in there? What amount of money would you take to ride off into the sunset, and it would be enough for your expenses? The nice thing is, if you're lucky, by that age, you have taken advantage of the tax code, and you've had a mortgage on a house, and you can deduct the interest payments on the mortgage and all that, and you may have very low housing costs. That's kind of the American dream, and it's what the tax code has facilitated people doing for some time. And so you might be able to get away with a replacement rate that might be something like 60%. In other words, you're earning through your benefit something like 60% of your paycheck that you would have beforehand, which is still a big hit of 40%. But of course, you get to spend the time not working, which is a very good thing. So the tax rate then, this balancing tax rate in the PAYGO system is a product of the replacement rate, which might be something like 80 or 70%, times this old age dependency ratio. So demography matters a bunch for this. To run this kind of thing then would be much more expensive in a society like Japan, where the old age dependency ratio is considerably higher, and it will become more expensive in a place like China, which is aging rather rapidly. It is somewhat expensive here, and it will get a little bit worse, but it's not nearly as cataclysmic looking, honestly, as it appears in Japan and China. Well, so suppose the old age dependency ratio were to rise by 33%. If you wanted to maintain the same replacement rate, then you would have to raise the PAYGO tax rate by 30%. I hope that's clear. It's true, and it comes out of our measuring of percentage changes in growth rates with the logarithm. So if you take the log of both sides, you could convince yourself that is the case. Measure the percentage changes in logarithm scale is sort of important. If you don't, then if you run through the math, you might find a problem. So the payroll tax rate then would have to rise if one of these things on the right-hand side goes up by a certain percentage. It's a mirror image. And currently what this might mean for you and me, so here we are again with US data. This is roughly a 33% increase in the old age dependency ratio, and so we're talking about an increase in the payroll tax rate of about 4 percentage points, which is something for sure. So a very real bottom line about the cost of demography, basically. It's good to have lots of workers in a Social Security arrangement, because that means they pay into the system, they can fund benefits, and if the number of workers per retiree is falling, if the number of retirees per worker is rising, then the finances get more strained, and you might have to raise taxes or lower benefits. So let's do some quick numbers here. Hopefully this is straightforward enough that we can kind of do this in our heads, because you could whip out a calculator, but we're not going to do that on the exam. If you saw a rise in the old age dependency ratio by 10%, what must happen to the replacement rate if the tax rate were to remain the same? Okay, let's close polling in 3, 2, 1. Okay, so the best answer there is B, that's good. If the old age dependency ratio, this thing here on the right, is higher by 10%, to keep the tax rate the same, you've also got to see a reduction then in this guy by 10%. Questions about that? Obviously, with the calculator, you could do many more complicated things than this sort of basic back-of-the-envelope story. Okay, well, let's do one more, and I regret I didn't change the number here. Suppose we saw a fall in the old age dependency ratio. Oops, sorry, let me turn that off as I, okay. We saw a reduction in the old age dependency ratio by 20%. What must happen to the tax rate if the replacement rate were to remain the same? And do please discuss with your friends. Okay, so let's close polling. In 3, 2, 1, let's close polling. Okay, so the best answer here is also B. This is kind of aging in reverse. If the old age dependency ratio were to be smaller, then, okay, so there's definitely some confusion. You would see a smaller tax rate that you would need to equalize total benefits and total taxes. Okay. So I wish I had a follow-up here. Does anybody want to ask a question? I know that's kind of hard to formulate. Anybody? So the correct answer here is B. So is anybody who maybe took a wrong guess there want to formulate why they're confused? Is it maybe, is this too hard to do without a calculator? Is that maybe the feeling? Yeah, okay. Okay, that's a fair point. Well, why don't we, yeah. How would you do it showing it mathematically? Yeah. Well, let me think. I'm trying to think about a useful, useful way of showing it here. Could you multiply both sides by 80%? Yeah, I guess. I'm not seeing how that would shake out. I'm trying to think of what would be helpful to say right here. And the way I think about this is that the math of growth rates is the same as the math of logarithms. So if you take the logarithm of both sides, you end up with the log of the tax rate is equal to the log of the replacement rate plus the log of the OADR. And so what this is saying is that the OADR falls by 20%, meaning that the log of the OADR changes by minus 0.2. I guess that's probably what I would do. Is that at all helpful? Let me see if I can show you this. Okay. So the tax rate is equal to, well, I guess that's just, it's always a little different. In Google Docs and the fraction, you could just choose it up here. So it's the replacement rate, the benefit rate divided by earnings times the OADR, so the number of oldies divided by the number of, is it W? Maybe we use W. Okay. All right. Take logs of both sides. Okay, so that's equal to the log of b over y plus the log of n0 over nw. Okay. All right. Now, if the OADR, which is equal to this part, I said N0 didn't I? NO. If the OADR falls by 0.2, that means that, what do we want to say here? This guy, the red part, falls by 0.2. Okay, so a percentage change in something means, you know, a change in the log of the ratio, right? That's how we've defined it in our RStudio labs. So a 20% drop in the OADR then is a reduction in this thing of 0.2. If the tax rate stays the same, what must happen to the, you know, it's technically log of the replacement rate, which is b over y. It has to rise by 0.2. So fall by 0.2 and rise by 0.2. Okay. Okay. I think I'm going to leave it there. You could also work through it with actual numbers. It might be a little bit more helpful. So let me just write this as a note. Note. If you work through this with actual numbers, make sure to take the log. Because a lot of times when we think about a percentage change in something, we do it this way. Don't do, you know, 1 plus the percent change, which would be 1.2. So those are slightly different, and it's because the log is different than the traditional way that we calculate percentages. Okay. Questions? Yeah. Yeah, I like that, right? The question is, can you explain what this means intuitively? So first of all, let me save this and I can put it on B courses. So this is class 12. Okay. Let's go back to the slide. And we fix this. This is the second one. Okay. All right. So what does this mean intuitively? Intuitively, you've got to have outflows equal to inflows. That was the math back here that gets us to this point. So let me just show that here, right? So outflows are inflows. You've got to have the amount of taxes collected on workers equal to the amount of benefits paid out to retirees. So how do you do that? Well, you need to adjust the tax rate so that this ratio of workers to retirees to workers, rather, reflected through the benefit rate then gives us equality across there. What the questions are setting us up to think about is, well, suppose the old age dependency ratio, the share of old folks per young folk, or the ratio, I shouldn't say the share, I guess, right, because they're different people, But if this number falls by 20%, that means that there are fewer old people per worker, and that should reduce this burden, right? It's the dependency burden, the old age dependency rate. You could think about that then as reducing the tax rate on workers. That is one way you might see. And I guess that's what we stipulated here. The natural thing is to think about a replacement rate that's constant, and that's what the question sets out. And then thinking about, well, what tax rate then must you see revealed? What tax rate do you need to have? And the answer is it's lower. So B is the right answer here. The tax rate falls by 20%. A reduction in the old age dependency ratio reduces dependency, and it reduces the tax rate that will fund benefits in retirement. So I really like your question because that's kind of the point. That's why we're here, is to cut to the chase. These are the mechanics of getting us a story, but we need the story. The story is important. It's not the actual mechanics of working through it so much. Other questions? Okay. So you might think a little bit about what the implicit rates of return are for pension systems. And this is something that, like I said earlier, right? A lot of things are so big, they're hard to see how they're salient to you and me. But you might well be thinking of this question: is Social Security a good thing for me? And you might phrase it in this way: is there a positive rate of return for you as a worker today in the United States, or if you're returning to a home country, there's probably a public pension there as well. So one way of viewing this is a simple way in which you account for this rather critical part of things. That the benefits paid out need to be multiplied by, this is a survivorship probability. So that factors into all this. Right, this is part of the problem why sometimes it can be a bad deal, especially for minority populations whose survivorship is lower than that of white non-Hispanics, for example. You pay into the system for sure as a worker because generally speaking, there's no chance you're going to die when you're young. It's true, some people do die, right? You pay into the system for sure. The problem is that your return depends on actually having lived to get the pension. Now, in reality, if you look at the trust fund, the trustees reports, the OASDI trustees, right? Old age survivors and disability insurance. So it turns out actually, if you die, then your survivors actually get something. So it's not as if they're totally left out to dry there. But this is an important point still, is that you have to live. And so the net return you might see might be calculated in this way. It's the log of this ratio of the probability weighted benefit. So the benefit you get times the chance that you're alive to actually receive it, divided by the tax that you paid. Here, the simple example that we had from last time was that you had a 100% chance of survival, but of course that's not actually totally accurate. A time frame of 30 years separating these age groups, and then the benefit that we didn't go greatly into this, but when you have a doubling of these generations each time, you get this rather nice payoff. You get a benefit of 8 units being transferred by the youngsters up to the oldsters, and that's nice. And it's because there are twice as many youngsters, so the tax the youngsters pay is actually just 4 units per youngster. It gets multiplied by this factor of 2 when things are doubling. So you get this sort of math, 8 times this 100% survival rate divided by the 4 that you pay in over a 30-year period. Totally rough back at the envelope. It still gives you a number that's not completely crazy, a 2.3% rate of return in this example. And that's actually not so far off of what you and I are seeing. So here's the next slide, and it shows that for people in the birth cohort, so it turns out here's me roughly, that's 1.9% internal rate of return for Social Security, born around 1975, ancient history. You guys born around 2000, about a 1.7% internal rate of return based on this particular forecast. Of course, a lot of these things, right, are based on forecasts because you haven't actually lived to that point. Congress has not managed to not gut the program. I mean, you don't know exactly what's going to happen in the future. But that's still a reasonable thing to measure. But now look at these so's and so's up here. People born in the 1876 birth cohort, of course, which is amazing to think about. But when Social Security in this country started, it was in 1933-ish or so, and the first checks were mailed out, I think, in the late 30s, maybe. So somebody born in 1876 would have been about 60, 65 at the dawn of the program. And so they saw this internal rate of return that was enormously high. Why? Well, they weren't alive as workers. They weren't around as workers. They had retired by the time the system actually started. And so all their benefits were paid by the current workers at the time, and they got this enormous windfall gain with a crazy internal rate of return of 36.5%. Now, the other thing to say, of course, is that different generations bear other burdens. Here's a cohort born in 1900 with a pretty hefty rate of return. This is also the birth cohort, of course, or slightly younger than this, that sent a lot of young people to die in World War I. The 1925 birth cohort in the earlier 20s or so was a cohort that sent a lot of young people to die in World War II. And also, they lived through the Great Depression, but their rates of return were higher because of the demography, really, and also when the system was begun. So about 2% return is kind of what you might be looking at. Again, given that the program would be around for you, and we could talk about that, but it probably will be. What you want to compare this to, though, is something like what you might earn on a risk-free investment like Treasury bills in real terms. Even that I'm saying this now, this is a little bit funny. That's actually above. So if anybody is interested in finance, a 2% rate of real return is actually rather high if you're thinking about current rates of return on Treasury bills. Did anybody see the news, incidentally? So what happened? What did the FOMC do today? By how much? Yeah, that's right. I think it's 50 basis points, right? A full half percentage point? Yeah. So the Federal Reserve cut interest rates by 50 basis points, half a percentage point today, right? Yeah. Now, the other thing that you could talk about is whether that's an adequate response to something that, so this has been talked about. The coronavirus is simultaneously a supply and a demand shock because it's likely to reduce demand by consumers for things, but it's also likely to reduce work. And it's likely to seriously interrupt supply chains. And the problem with supply shocks is that monetary policy is not well situated to do that sort of thing. With an additional cut, what has already been fairly bad in terms of what's usually called the money market. So Treasury bills are in the money market. It's risk-free, or at least viewed that way, and it typically has been. It turns out there actually was a period of time in the 70s when the U.S. government managed to sort of default, actually, by accident and sort of made up for it afterward. But basically, it's risk-free, and this is far less than the usual stock market average. And of course, if you have any money in stocks, and some of you may, that last week was bad, to say the least. The other thing that, this sort of rate of return that you get from a pension system insures you against a lot of risks that are out there. Social Security is insurance against living too long. It's a pension that you will always get as long as you are alive. And the same is not true of your pool of stocks or your bank account. Your bank account doesn't care if you live too long and keep withdrawing from it. It'll just eventually reach zero. And a pension in this form, a defined benefit pension, will never run dry as long as you live. So that's a very nice thing, and in particular in the course of the 1930s, when those generations were living through the Great Depression and there wasn't a lot of security of much of anything, definitely not of employment, definitely not of assets, asset prices or anything. This is a big deal. Poor timing of the market also you get insulated against. And so, if any of you have parents or grandparents who are, in their sort of mid-60s, approaching 70, this last week was probably very psychologically hard for them because they may well be seeing their retirement assets drop in value. I think it was like a 10% reduction. Did anybody remember what that was last week? I think on the order of that. A market correction is usually, what it was called, and it's a pretty hefty hit. And then the other thing too is that, you may view this in a variety of ways, but different people with different portfolios will get different returns on their investments because they have different portfolios. And so there's a lot of individual variation in investments, and you may view that as a good thing, that you can maybe get ahead of the market. Maybe you view it as a bad thing, though, and there are kind of two prevailing views about that. I suppose if you're really good into picking companies and stocks and all that, you could maybe get ahead. But there's a school of thought that it's better just to own the market, as they say. Just buy an index fund and just let it happen and not worry about that. And so that helps a little bit, but people can really get hosed if the company they've got all their wealth in suddenly goes belly up or something. Let's talk about the trust fund. There is a trust fund. Trust fund is sort of a pejorative thing, I think. If you know of somebody, oh, that guy has a trust fund, right? Well, we all have a trust fund. It's called the Social Security Trust Fund. And this is still, I think, roughly accurate. It's out of date. I don't know what anybody remember looking in the trustees report, like what the date of exhaustion is forecast to be? 2035 now. So here's 2038 or 37, I guess, maybe in this particular snapshot from a year or two ago. And now it's 2035, which I will be 62. So not quite old enough to get out while the getting's good. So you and I are all going to have to deal with this. This is happening. The trust fund will become exhausted, and then when the trust fund becomes exhausted, that means either, you're basically snapping back to the math of the pay-go pensions. You're snapping back to this kind of thing, right? This will have to happen after the trust fund gets exhausted. If there's a trust fund, you can draw it down. If there isn't a trust fund, then you can't, and so you're back in this world. And so at that point, something is going to happen. I think it's a wise guess to say it's going to be some mix of tax increases on you guys and to some extent me, and benefit reductions for me and also, unfortunately, for you guys in the future. So this is a graph that it shows it just sort of assumes, right, that the expenditures just go all the way down to Social Security, system income, which means payroll taxes. So this is what's happening to that. There was a big increase, and it will still increase some more. So here's the year 2030. So that's kind of the peak of it all. Why is this happening so much? It's the aging of the baby boom generation. And I think many of whom now are retired. That pushes up Social Security spending. So, yeah, we're giving a kind of a cursory take here in this class, and there's a lot to say about this. I think it's maybe because so many other things seem more pressing these days, right? 20 years ago, everybody was talking about saving Social Security. It was one of the planks in Al Gore's platform as he ran as the Democratic candidate for president in the year 2000, was saving Social Security. It was the famous calling for a Social Security lockbox, whatever in the world that meant. He managed to mystify everybody with that. These days, it's all about inequality and climate change and, just a complete 180 in the direction that the country's going. It's all about that. It's not about saving Social Security. This problem will be there, but, it's true that we can kick the can further down the road, I guess. Here's 2020, and we've got another, 15 years, I guess. The 2035 is the exhaustion date. Yeah. Things are crazier in other countries. So this emeritus professor Ron Lee used to teach this course, calculated a bunch of this from an older paper. So a lot of this is a little bit out of date, but it's still probably roughly right. And it gives you the sense of the different generosity of these pension systems. That's what this first column is. So in France, there's a very generous public pension system. I think that's still true. Also in Italy, Spain, and Japan. And down here at the bottom, right? So we're in relatively good shape in this sense that Social Security is not so generous as to, be such a high replacement rate. It gives you a little bit of hope. I don't know. I guess you could also view it the other way, that there's room to cut, something like this down, I guess. This is a very high replacement rate, and so with an old age dependency ratio of something like 55% in France, it translates into an implied payroll tax rate of 50%. And that's just to fund the retirement system. That's not everything else, right? There's all kinds of stuff that you need to collect taxes to do. You've got to, have some kind of border security. You've got to fund the National Institutes of Health and the CDC to protect us and think about stuff happening during these crazy outbreaks. Right? There's all kinds of things that need to happen. And so we are sitting relatively pretty, I think, relative to these other industrialized countries. And part of it, honestly, is an answer where the public pension system isn't the only game in town. That's also not given very long shrift here, but in the United States, we've long had this system where there is Social Security, and there also is reliance on privately held assets, stock portfolios. Again, it's why many of your parents and grandparents may not be very happy after last week's stock market correction, right? And the other thing would be transfers from family, for example. Okay, so that's going to be it for Social Security. Questions about that? So last topic in the 30 minutes we have left then is the demographic transition. Questions? The learning objectives are question.
So in the last table, you said European countries such as France and Spain
Yeah.
have a really high earnings replacement rate. Is there an option for the government to lower the earnings replacement rate so then to increase the tax rate?
Right, that's a really good point. So let me restate that question, having put up back here again the math. So I was about to say a learning objective is to understand this math, and if we write it down, to please be able to use it. And so now I'm going to use it then to translate what you just said. What she said is, well, so the replacement rates, which are the benefits per retiree divided by the earnings per worker. So in France, a number like 90%. A very, very high replacement rate. And so if the old age dependency ratio becomes rather high, like it is in France, it implies this very high tax rate of like 50%. And her question was, well, isn't there a way to change the benefit replacement rate, so that the tax rate wouldn't have to be so darn high like it is in this table? And that's a very good question, and it's what we would expect you to be able to ask, basically. So you hit the nail on the head. That's a learning objective, to be able to say it like that. Why couldn't a country think about changing the earnings replacement ratio, if you like, the benefit replacement rate, that's what this is, reducing that so that given the demography, this wasn't so darn high. And so to answer the question quickly, it's political, right? Big time, especially in a place like France, also here. Other questions? Okay, so let's talk about the demographic transition. I love the subtitle, the demographic transition. I forgot the colon. A story of changing birth and death rates. It's a story about history. That's what the demographic transition is. It's one of the, I think, the greatest sort of insights that the field of demography has provided to the scientific community and to the world, is that this tends to happen, the demographic transition, in many, many different human populations. So it may seem obvious today, and it's kind of a rule of thumb. The transition doesn't always happen in the same way everywhere, and that's one of the points of Lab 6, which I hadn't honestly known, but apparently it looks a little different in Japan with this interesting sort of dip in the dependency ratio. But stepping back, it seems to be kind of a law of human nature. Now, precisely why is a much longer story. But it's a pattern that seems to fit pretty much every human population we know, more or less, with a little bit of wiggle around that. In the 1970s, it wasn't nearly so obvious, but it seems to be more clear now. So the idealized description of this, in early pre-industrial, usually, history, and if you're thinking about advanced economies today, and also developing countries, usually you're in a situation with high fertility and high mortality, large family sizes, and a pretty big bite of mortality across the age range. And in particular, and we'll get into this more when we talk about fertility after the midterm, tragically high infant mortality rates. Just absolutely awful, right? The worst thing in the world, to go through a pregnancy and family planning and all that, and then have an infant, and then the infant dies. And this was the story about humanity for a very long period of time. And that's part of the motivation, of course, for having high fertility rates, is that just to get a few surviving children, you would have to have a ton of children. There are other parts of the story, of course, but mortality being so very high primarily because of infectious disease. So part of this that we're not going to go into great detail, but it's what's called the epidemiologic transition, away from everybody dying of infectious disease. And so, of course, behind the scenes, right, with the coronavirus thing is that it actually is true that coronavirus doesn't have this ridiculously high mortality rate. We think it's probably something that we need to think about. It's not ridiculously high, but it's enough to worry about. And in general, though, part of the reason why it's so scary, I think, is because we have a good handle on infectious disease mortality more generally. We have things, antibiotics that'll actually counteract it all. So a big reduction during the demographic transition, the first stage, in mortality because of progress against infectious disease. So mortality falls first, fertility decline will lag. And precisely why is a little unclear, but it's probably because people take time to adapt and to internalize the knowledge of maybe what has happened. And so there's much more to say about that in the economics of fertility that will start after the midterm. So fertility finally then falls later, after the demographic transition. Fluctuations in population growth then because of little bubbles and blips in fertility, that shows up in the lab. And then sub-replacement demography refers to how the fertility rate could fall below the replacement level of fertility, meaning the biological male and the female reproduce themselves. The female bears 2 and a little bit more children per female over a lifespan on average. Not everybody has to do that. But the replacement level of the total fertility rate is about 2.1 because there's a little of mortality that will bite along the way. So it's basically reproducing the male and the female contribution per each female. That's the story. So the number like 2, and it's a little bit higher than that, that's replacement fertility. So this is what the demographic transition looks like. It's a stylized picture. Fluctuations around here, I think I didn't emphasize that, right? So there's changes in the crude death rate that things can be a little bit better in some years, a little bit worse in some years, a little bit better in some years, a little bit worse, and things like that, but sort of fluctuating around. And then a big reduction, usually because of progress against infectious disease. In the advanced countries today, this was scientific knowledge, but also advances in public health. Things like clean drinking water brought to you by municipal utilities and governments. Things like education campaigns about, again, washing one's hands. Basic stuff like that. In developing countries today, it might be things like developing better mosquito nets for anti-malaria campaigns, things like that. There's a lot of technology that goes into keeping people from falling ill, to managing these infectious diseases, which are, by their nature, right? They're infectious disease. They're spread from person to person. It could be through a mosquito or maybe a rat or something like that, or I guess it was fleas, right, in the case of the Black Death. Or it could be direct, that people might transmit the thing between them. And so it's this externality, right, that public health commitments are vital in trying to counteract. When this happens, crude death rate falls a bunch. There's a lag then before the crude birth rate or the fertility rate starts to fall. And then you might see some sort of bounces around here, maybe a baby boom, it looks like. When this opens up, it's the same kind of story as with the Malthus model, that you would see a growth rate that would increase where it had been previously 0 up to some potentially high level and then back down again. So here we see it in Sweden over a very long period of time. You might say it's a kind of a slow transition dating back to, I think we're measuring, I think the 1950 means, well, I don't know why that's there. Actually, I'm sorry. I think this is Sweden, and it's starting in 1775, and I think this is Mexico starting after 1900, I think, is the deal with that. I don't know what that 1950 is doing there. Mexico maybe fits the picture a little bit better. A very slow ride for Sweden, as I think might be true of many of the advanced economies today. So what we're talking about is a TFR, a total fertility rate greater than 6 children per woman on average, which is just mind-boggling to me. But the humans are capable of that. It just meant, as we'll talk about more, if you're doing that, if you're producing 6 humans, you're not doing too much else, right? There's not a lot of other time to do anything else other than just eat and sleep and get through the day. Now, admittedly, that's the gross number of children. Then you have mortality that would then reduce the family size, but still being pregnant 6 times on average, that's a lot. That's seriously a lot. Life expectancy from birth of about 40 to 50. And let me just say one thing there. Remember that life expectancy at birth is an average length of life given that you're born. So a number like 40 or 50 doesn't mean that adults die at age 50. It means that, on average, you were born and there was a bunch of infant mortality that just knocked down that average a ton, and people who survived into their adolescence typically live to an age more like 65 or 70 or something like that. So it's a number that encapsulates this great, great cost of infant mortality. That's really the big story in this period of development. It's infant mortality that pulls this thing so far down to 40 or 50. Today, of course, the number is more like 80. Korea 1950, here's a story about a difference in crude birth rate and crude death rate. And I wish we had an updated version of that. So Korea started then before this transition is 1950. Then during the transition, of course, the growth rate increased, the fertility rate stayed high, but then I think has really come down to earth very rapidly. Okay, so post-transition then is where we're headed. A TFR, a total fertility rate about 2, or it could be much lower. I don't think we know of many places where the TFR has been consistently above 2. It used to be true that the United States had a total fertility rate a bit higher than replacement, more like 2.2 or something, and that has not been the case now for about 10 or 15 years. So population growth rates then, and this is an image from Ron Lee's 2003 paper. Population growth rates were very low prior to the transition. So these 3 different lines show you that these, either for the world as a whole, that's the dark one, or the more developed regions, that's this one, where population growth took off a little bit sooner, and then didn't peak as high, and then came back down. This is even negative growth here, forecast, of course, around 2040, 2050, and it's because of low fertility. This is the developing world, and so I guess the thing to keep in mind here is that, so when he wrote it, this was history to the left of this vertical line, and everything to the right was going to be forecast. So, this is forecast in the developed world, but even when he was writing it in 2000, in fact, this had already happened. The thing had peaked here, I guess around 1990, something like that, and then had started to fall. An empirical regularity of one of the most important kinds, to say, well, this seems to happen. And of course, the big question is whether things like this will continue to happen. The way this slide shows it, it certainly suggested it would. But of course, in any particular case, right, if you were looking at a country that had a lot of differences, different cultures, different labor markets, different empowerment of women and families and things like that, you might see different things. And so, it raises the question whether this would be continued. But this is the pattern, and it appears to be fairly general to human populations. So what are the consequences then of this pattern? Well, age structure is one of the big ones. And so what does age structure mean for things we care about? You could get granular with these trajectories over the life cycle. That's the ages here is on the x-axis. These trajectories, either here in India on the left or Germany on the right, they look rather similar. Trajectories of consumption and earnings over the life cycle. Or you could simplify a little bit by using the old age dependency ratios and things like that, or total dependency ratios, to simplify these broad patterns that are useful, right? So the big differences here are that the young are dependent. The folks in working age are the ones who are shouldering the burden, who are producing more in terms of labor earnings and then shifting those surpluses up and down the age range. They have to, right? So it's useful then to think about the working age folks and then the percentages of these 2 other groups that are more dependent because they're consuming more than they're earning. So what we typically would do then is either look at the old age dependency ratio or, in a broader sense, because the young are also expensive. And we'll talk about that more also after the midterm, and increasingly so. College is expensive. That's kind of the big one, right? I mean, I guess healthcare. So kids also require healthcare, as I found out in January. We skipped a class. Just as an aside, so you want to take a guess about how much the hospital bill was for 4 nights in the hospital? Was it like $4,000 or $40,000 or $400,000? It was, yeah, so I'm hearing 4,000. What do you guys think? Any other guesses? So it's not $400,000, right? People are ruling that one out. It was $40,000. That was the hospital bill. Now, we have insurance. But the hospital bill said $40,000. Our out-of-pocket was $250. Yeah. Health economics, Econ 157, coming in summer term starting in May. I'll be teaching that. That's the price tag. Hospital care is very expensive. And the thing is, if you doubt whether that's actually the price, I mean, that's the thing. Well, what does it mean to have health insurance? Well, it's insulation against paying out of pocket. But if you doubt that it was actually $40,000 for 4 nights in the hospital, let me tell you just how many people visited us every second of every hour we were in the hospital. And of course, why? Well, partly it's because this patient was 1 year old. She has, I don't know, 85 years of life ahead of her, of paying into some health insurance system and paying taxes and being a productive member of society, and also not generating a lawsuit, and all those sorts of things all matter. Okay. All right, so kids matter, and so that's why we might want to do a total dependency ratio, which is the sum of a youth dependency. So you're looking at the young, and you might define them in this way, or maybe under 20. If you define this as, say, 20 to 65, you could do it that way too. So you'll see different versions of that, and then what you might see are these differences in the total dependency. So I really should have brought my reading glasses here. So these are different age structure, and you'll see different implications then for the total dependency over the period of time. So this is Vietnam. I'm sorry, I haven't stared at this with great detail, and I should have. Starting in 1950, a very pyramidal age shape here in Vietnam. I think we're combining both sexes. Here, so then a demographic transition, where suddenly what has happened, a big flaring out here because mortality has fallen in Vietnam during this early period of progress against infectious disease. And then finally transitioning more toward what we probably would associate as being an advanced country, that kind of shape in 2075. Here's more like where we are today in Vietnam. And so you might wonder then what the story is for the total dependency burden, and it is kind of a complicated picture. So this is my favorite chart of all time, I think. It's just great. This is from Ronald Lee's 2003 paper. And what we're doing is looking at India, starting in 1900 and tracing it all the way out into the future. So the dots are actual history, I think. Yeah, maybe they're not. So at some point, right, I guess it's the year 2000. So that's where we are with reality versus forecast. Well, so we already saw a big reduction in the fertility rate. So pardon me, I just make sure I can see this right. If you're right here in the middle of the classroom, here's 2000, and so there was actually reality to the left, and then forecast to the right. So we already saw this big reduction in fertility, a steady increase in life expectancy, and then a big spike in the population growth rate in India, and a reduction in the population growth rate. So we're still, above where the growth rate was, say back around 1950. Folks will remind me, what was the birth year of the country of India? 1947. So this is around the time of separation from colonial rule, of course. So a big increase, a maximum here, and then a reduction. And so we're already into actual data. Then back over to this side of the curve there. A big increase in population size and a forecast, though, of a plateauing, which we haven't hit yet. We're still in a period of growth. And then finally, this is the real, the gangbusters killer chart down here, which shows you a bunch of things overlapping. But it's the total dependency ratio here, this thing that dips, or rather rises first, swells. So the total dependency ratio actually rises at first. And it's because you've got more surviving children, mortality has fallen, fertility has not yet fallen. You've got a ton of kids, and that increases the dependency burden. And then a big reduction here. A big reduction is as those kids are, as fertility starts to fall, and those kids are, I mean, that's the funny way of phrasing it, I guess, right? They are then themselves having fewer children. So the early beneficiaries of the reduction in mortality are then later not having as many children as their parents did. So the number of kids is falling, but then finally an increase again. And so some nadir down here, then an increase driven by this old age dependency ratio here. The share of folks over 65 as a proportion of the working age. So a big increase, here, and then behind the scenes, of course, the denominator is shifting as the big sort of bonus kids who didn't die are shifted into the working ages, which is really great. So a big increase and then a reduction in the dependency. This would be called then the demographic dividend. A big reduction in dependency before the old age dependency story really kicks in, and it's driven by the reduction in youth dependency, the reduction in fertility. So this came up in office hours too. I'm not sure I have it written down. The demographic dividend. It's useful as you're working age to have fewer dependents, and they can be young, so kids you're taking care of, and they can also be old, like your parents. And of course, in this country, I would not tell you that I'm taking care of my parents because I'm not. But behind the scenes, there's a public pension called Social Security that is taking my earnings and chopping it up and sending it out to everybody who's over 65 and has claimed the benefit, right? And including my parents. So in that sense, I am. So it's sort of figurative for many economies. The demographic dividend then is this benefit of having fewer dependents, whether they're old or young. And in this case, it's driven by the second curve is the youth dependency ratio, a big reduction in that as fertility falls during the demographic transition. It pulls down total dependency. And it means that working age folks have a bigger surplus, if you will, to do with what they will. They could invest it into capital. They could blow it on consumption spending, I suppose. But usually the research on this suggests that a lot of it goes into capital. And it does things, for example, like fuel the great growth that we have seen, especially in South Korea, and also probably in India and in China. Excess funds that you're not spending on kids anymore, and you can invest it, and it becomes capital through capital markets. Questions about this? Learning objectives. Demographic transition, what happens first, mortality or fertility? Mortality falls first. Fertility falls later. That's just kind of key. It is a pattern that seems to be replicated in pretty much all human populations. Yeah?
In post-transition, are we still finding positive population growth, but it's just
Positive population growth, yeah, we don't, oh, here's the growth rate. So it ends up being small and positive here. It could be different, it could be negative. And so the pattern is, again, the question is, well, so what about the population growth rate? And the answer is it's always much, much higher during this first stage of the transition when mortality falls but fertility hasn't fallen yet. That we know for sure. What happens later is less clear. And it could be a situation where you've got population decline, like currently in places like Japan. And actually South Korea might also have negative population growth. I don't know that for sure. I think Italy might also. Typically places with very low fertility have maybe negative population growth rates. So it varies. In the United States, we don't. I don't think, ever had a negative population growth rate. I don't know when we might have. Other questions? Okay, the last and then rather challenging part of things then is this very striking paper by Ronald Lee. Let me just advance up to this point here. Ronald Lee, Andy Mason, and all of the researchers in the National Transfer Accounts Network. And the punchlines here are that they're trying to assess this issue of optimal fertility. To reassess it, I guess, given better data on things like saving, on things like transfers between working age people and old people and young people. The basic feeling here was that you wouldn't want to have a really low fertility rate, probably, because of negative population growth, and that doesn't necessarily seem like a particularly good thing. Now, I think we already had some sense that maybe population decline might not be really the worst. I mean, you could look at it from the perspective of like climate change, where it's not all that clear that having a human population in decline is a bad thing. It might be good if you've got a finite Earth. Maybe it's okay to have fewer and fewer people. But I think in the class story that has emerged thus far, I think what we've also seen though is a pretty compelling case that having more people is good for things like technology and production of knowledge and ideas and marketplaces and better ways of doing just about everything. So that's the story of Paul Romer and Esther Boserup. Here, so they're revisiting this question of what might be an optimal fertility rate if you were thinking about measuring all these different important things, the uses of economic resources. You go into the labor market as a working age person and you earn in the labor market. What do you do with your earnings? Do you support children? Do you support the elderly? Do you buy capital? How much more productive does the capital make you? All these things are important. So they are basically reassessing these issues. What would be the optimal rate of fertility, assuming, and I think mortality is assumed to be doing whatever it's doing. And punchlines then end up being something like this, where let me just say what these numbers mean. They are optimal long-run total fertility rates. And probably the most salient thing to say is that replacement fertility is the number 2.1. It shows up right here. And for many of these, the cells are actually showing us a number that is less than the number 2.1. So I think this is a big surprise to a lot of people. The optimal fertility rate, if you factor in all these things like transfers, capital investment, and things like that, might actually be less than replacement. So that's really the chief contribution that they're after here. It varies by level of development, and it's because, for example, here looking at so public transfers, I think here, and then public and private transfers. So it's based on age structure, and so you'll see different stories across the different regions. But the learning objective I want you to take away from this is that it's fertility is useful. It produces more people. But all these different things have benefits and costs associated with them. And so one thing that they did is think about the costs of different fertility rates versus, if you like, the opportunity cost. Suppose you did something else. Suppose you had fewer kids and did something different with your resources. And one of the things, of course, you can do with resources is thinking about your consumption. Also thinking about if you don't spend on consumption, you might save. So that's kind of the big picture here. I think I'm trying to wave my hands and make a very complicated thing, more compact. It might be, if you believe the outcome here, and they show it, I think, rather convincingly with these different scenarios, that moderately low fertility, below replacement, might actually be optimal, given the budget constraints, if you will. What happens if you save and produce more capital? You get more. You become wealthier. One of the things about fertility is that if you have a higher population growth rate, this is straight out of the Solow model, a higher population growth rate reduces capital per worker, other things equal. So reducing fertility given a particular saving rate, gives you more capital per worker and a higher standard of living. That's part of what's going on here. But the other problem, of course, is that if you have fewer children, especially below replacement, then support of the elderly in particular becomes more costly because you've got fewer workers around to help pay pensions. Right, so that's a clear cost. You've got low fertility, pensions are much more expensive. If you got low fertility, however, capital is in some sense cheaper, I guess you could think of it that way. You don't have to spend as much replacing the capital stock because you've already got low fertility. So that's one view. It doesn't take into effect anything about the endogeneity of technology, right? So that's what Romer and Bozerup say, is that it's a function of population. Questions about that? That's the very last topic.